It's important to realise that the identification of Burke with conservatism is a result of one particular event in world history and his position, the position that he took in relation to that one event. And that one event is the French Revolution. Because Burke took a critical position in relation to the revolution, he subsequently, later, became associated with conservatism. But of course, that's a sort of complicated move. So to speak about Burke and conservatism, therefore, involves having a view essentially of three things. First of all, obviously, Burke. Second of all, conservatism. And third of all, the French Revolution, which is a sort of key moment in world history in relation to which people orientate themselves in connection with whether something is conservative, that's to say traditional or retrograde or progressive. So I'm going to say a bit about each of those. I'm going to say a bit about Burke, a bit about the French Revolution, and a bit about conservatism, because that, I think saying something about all three essentially clarifies the position. So, well, Burke himself was both a statesman and a thinker writing in the 18th century, and he was obliged as a statesman to take up positions in relation to basically British domestic politics. But Britain at the time was both an imperial power and a world power, as a result of which Burke necessarily had to take up positions in relation to international trade, the British colonies, and the European balance of power. It's a result of this last issue, the European balance of power, that the French Revolution became important to him, because anything that happened in France, which was a leading power in the 18th century, affected Britain. So it was a result of that. As soon as the revolution broke in France, he was obliged in some sense to make a response. As I said at the beginning, his response was critical. And that's because, interestingly, he associated the revolution not with progress, but with retrogression. In other words, he thought it was a step back in history, not a move forward. That's sort of difficult for modern commentators to understand, because it's so fundamental to modern thinking, both in Europe and in the United States, and of course in Russia especially also. It's so fundamental to think of the French Revolution as a progressive moment in history. That's largely because, I would say, because of two teleologies. One, the idea that the French Revolution necessarily culminated in liberal democracy. That's one teleology, the notion that something that happened in 1789 was inevitably going to develop into the post-war Western settlement, liberal democracy in other words. So the second association, as it were, the second terminus, as it's often seen, of the revolution is communist revolution, and that's to say Marxism-Leninism was highly influential in construing 1789 as a stepping stone on the way to comprehensive proletarian revolution. But of course, that's a view of history, not an historical fact. And once again, I would say there is no necessary connection between 1789. Once again, it's worth emphasizing the attempt to establish a parliamentary monarchy in France and proletarian revolution, world proletarian revolution. So that's all a long way of saying that the French Revolution is associated from various angles with modern progressive ideologies, but these are views of progress. And Burke, for his part, had a different view of progress, and he thought the attempt to establish a parliamentary monarchy in France was retrogressive, not progressive, and not anticipating these other later developments, because how could it anticipate these other later developments? Because it had never thought of these later developments. So the question is, why did Burke think that it was retrogressive rather than progressive? And that's because he thought the French attempt to establish parliamentary monarchy was done on the basis of having no durable foundations for the project. That's to say, as far as Burke was concerned, if you're going to have a parliamentary monarchy, you need various component elements. And those component elements include intermediary ranks in society, but the French Revolution in due course sought to abolish those. A parliamentary monarchy would also require a system of property, but the French Revolution soon began to undermine the system of property, certainly as far as Burke was concerned. And it would also need sort of some foundation for authority, and Burke thought that the French Revolution undermined this also. So Burke's view is actually that the French attempted to establish something, but in the process of trying to establish it, they undermined all the component elements which were prerequisites for its establishment. Therefore, the revolution was self-destroying. And as opposed to being, therefore, a moment looking into the sunny uplands of a progressive future, it was a sort of, had introduced a downward spiral of anarchical strife and struggle into France and in due course in Europe, and therefore if one were to orientate oneself in world history, one wouldn't seek to, insofar as one would seek to conserve something, it wouldn't be the revolution. One would rather have to avoid it and direct oneself down a different course. So that's why this debate is so complicated. Burke's opposition to the revolution is his opposition to what he believed was a delusive vision of progress. So by the time that Burke came to write about the French Revolution, beginning in February 1790, that's the first time he took a public stand on the revolution, he was associated in Europe, but particularly in British public life, with the defense of two principles: the defense of liberty and the defense of the right of resistance against illegitimate government. So this is what people associated him with. However, it's important to recognize that both these principles had limitations. That's to say, well, the right of resistance had to be under extreme conditions. I mean, one couldn't just resist, at all, in relation to everything that one decided arbitrarily one didn't like. And equally, liberty had preconditions for its security. So in defending liberty and the right of resistance, he also, at the same time, was implicitly defending some view of authority. So it's right to think of Burke, like most political thinkers, as defending some notion of authority, and because his defense of authority became particularly prominent in the context of his opposition to the French Revolution, people associate him with a sort of conservative defense of authority. So it's worth thinking about why that is. It is indeed the case that Burke defended authority, and he defended authority as having two component elements. First of all, authority was legitimate insofar as it was supported by popular consent. That's number one, but that's rather straightforward. At the same time, as far as Burke was concerned, authority was more entrenched insofar as it was supported by what we might call tradition. So for that reason, especially in a book he wrote called The Reflections on the Revolution of France, which was published in November 1790, Burke launched himself upon a defense of a particular notion of authority as supported by tradition. But readers of that work therefore associate Burke with a defense of authority, as it were, no matter what. But I think it's important to realize that that is definitely a misinterpretation of what he is saying. Of course, he's defending some species of authority, some species of tradition. But of course, it wouldn't take long to recognize that every modern ideology that one can think of is supported by some vision of tradition. That's to say, just think of Bolshevism. I mean, there's a Bolshevist tradition. There's the paraphernalia of Bolshevist tradition. There are liberal traditions, and so on and so forth. But whilst Burke is defending some species of authority, some species of tradition, it's not tradition at all costs. As far as Burke was concerned, in the end, tradition was a way of protecting rights, but rights were more fundamental to tradition. In other words, it's important to realize that for Burke's thinking, rights, if you like, trump tradition, and therefore tradition is conditional. At this point, we're getting into the terrain of conservatism, which is often seen as a defense of tradition come what may. That's to say, a defense of tradition no matter what. It's clearly the case that this is not Burke's position. So from that point of view, it's very difficult to present Burke as simply a conservative. There's another sort of very important point to make, and that's to say that virtually any modern political ideology that I can think of is seeking to conserve something, and therefore all modern ideologies have some conservative component. So I tend to think of conservatism as not a trans-historical political category, but rather a sort of variable. And as soon as one realizes that it's a variable rather than a stable concept, I don't say that it's meaningless, but it begins to disintegrate. Certainly, conservative movements have reinvented themselves as traditions, but if you then examine those traditions historically, you will see that they've changed over time. I would say, therefore, conservatism is has been a variable historical project over time. And the interesting thing about Burke is that insofar as he's associated with conservatism, he predates any self-conscious existence of the ideology. That's to say, in the period in which Burke is writing, so he's born in 1730 and dies in 1797, throughout that period, the word conservatism doesn't exist in any European language. Second of all, a conservative party does not exist in any European country. So that's to say, conservatism has to be a sort of belated projection onto the period. So that's all to say that conservatism has no historical traction in the period. It makes no clear ideological sense in the period, and therefore we have to talk about two problems of Burke and conservatism rather than this later historical invention, which is the conservatism of Edmund Burke.